Welcome back, students. This is the third and final installment on my lectures on physiology of hearing. I hope by this time you have understood the functional anatomy of the human ear and the portion I had just discussed on sound transduction. Today I shall be continuing with the sound transduction part in the inner ear. And then I shall be discussing about concepts of decibel, about concepts of how the pitch, the amplitude and the localization of sound is perceived by the human ear. Few applied part like audiometry and lastly deafness. So bear with me. It is going to be a bit long and taxing session. Sound transduction in the inner ear. Up till now, we have learned that incident sound waves, they fall upon the tympanic membrane, resulting in exertion of a sound pressure over the tympanic membrane that causes the movement of the membrane in and out pattern, which is transduced through the middle ear cavity via the ossicular chain, and finally there is to and fro movement of the footplate of the stapes, just like a hinged door with the hinge attached to the posterior margin of the oval window. Beyond the oval window lies the perilymph of the scala vestibuli. The movements of the footplate of the stapes set up a series of traveling waves in the perilymph of the scala vestibuli. So the movement of the stapes, which was still in the air phase, is now transmitted to the fluid or liquid phase of the perilymph, and this movement occurs as a series of traveling waves. Now, as the waves move up the cochlea, its height increases to a maximum and drops off rapidly. If you remember, the cochlea is a 2 3/4 curved structure. If we unfurl it, it becomes like a long tube. The waves move up the cochlea, its height increases to a maximum and then drops off rapidly. Now, what is the protocol of height increment? Now, the distance from the stapes to the point of maximum vibration or height varies with the frequency of the vibrations of the initiating wave. Or in other words, the higher the frequency of the sound wave that fall upon the tympanic membrane, the distance from the stapes to the point of maximum height of the wave will depend upon it. So, it's the frequency of the sound that determines where the maximum height of the wave in the perilymph will be in terms of the cochlear length. It has been found that high-pitched sounds generate waves that reach maximum height near the base of the cochlea, while low-pitched sounds generate waves that peak near the apex of the cochlea. Or in other words, if a sound is high-pitched, means more frequencies per second, then the peak of the wave of the perilymph will be nearer to the base, while if it is a low-pitched sound, then the peaks will be farther away from the base and more nearer to the apex. Since the cochlea is encased in a bony wall, these waves in the perilymph do not have anywhere to dissipate. So they keep on traveling towards the apex. And while traveling, they cause depressions on the rhizomus and then followed by the basilar membrane. And it is further transmitted to the scala tympani, which is below the basilar membrane. So the traveling waves cause successive depressions of the rhizomus and the basilar membrane because these are not rigid structures, and ultimately there is a depression or movement of the scala tympani, which also contains the perilymph. Now what happens thereafter? From the fluid in the scala tympani, these waves will now move back towards the round window because that's the only way they can move. They cannot move through the walls because they are formed by the bony labyrinth. At the round window, there is, I have already said, a secondary tympanic membrane which helps in dissipation of the waves into the air of the middle ear cavity. So ultimately, these waves die down as they reach the round window. Now this is how sound produces distortion of the basilar membrane, and the site at which this distortion is maximal is determined by the frequency of the sound wave. This diagram will try to explain what I was saying in a more pictorial way. You can see that the distance from the stapes is marked in millimeters. As I have said, the cochlea is about 35 millimeter long. Now it has been seen that a sound wave having a frequency of 1600 Hz causes maximal displacement between 10 and 20 millimeter basilar membrane length, while a sound wave of 50 Hz causes a maximal displacement almost near the apex of the cochlea. So the place where the basilar membrane will be maximally displaced is determined by the frequency of the incident sound wave. Up till now, we have been talking about the movement of the perilymph and its associated movement of rhizomus and basilar membrane, and where the basilar membrane will move maximally according to the frequency of the sound. But how sound is perceived? Let's discuss that. Now, as I have said, as the basilar membrane moves up and down, you can imagine that the hair cells overlying it via the organ of Corti will also move along in the same up and down direction. The tectorial membrane which overlies the hair cell. If you remember, the tectorial membrane was a viscous elastic membrane overlying the tips of the hair cells, and it is attached at an angle to the basilar membrane. And any movement of the basilar membrane in the vertical plane, that is up and down, results in an apparent antero-posterior movement of the tectorial membrane. So as the basilar membrane moves up or down, the tectorial membrane, because of its pivot-like attachment, does not move up and down, but it moves back and front, back and front. So there is an antero-posterior movement of the tectorial membrane brought about by the up and down movement of the basilar membrane. What happens next? If you remember, the tips of the stereocilia of the outer hair cells are embedded in the tectorial membrane. So up and down movement of the basilar membrane results in their bending. When the tectorial membrane moves Anteroposteriorly, the stereocilia will move accordingly. What happens to the stereocilia of the inner hair cells? They are not embedded in the tectorial membrane, but what happens to them? They also move. Why? Because the hair cells of the inner hair, or the tips of the inner hair cells, are not attached to the tectorial membrane, but the endolymph, which is surrounding the inner hair cells as well as the outer hair cell tips, because of the movement of the tectorial membrane, the fluid moves. This movement of the fluid causes movement of the hair cells, or the tips of the hair cells of the inner hair cells also. So basically, the basilar membrane moves up and down, causes anteroposterior movement of the tectorial membrane, and sets up fluid movement within the endolymph. This causes movement of the tips of the stereocilia of the inner hair cells as well as the outer hair cells. This movement of the stereocilia, as I have already discussed earlier, will further cause depolarization or hyperpolarization of the inner hair cells, which in turn will cause the firing of the hair cells and release of neurotransmitters, which is picked up by the nerve endings of the sensory nerve terminals, which ultimately forms the cochlear division of vestibulocochlear nerve. If you remember this diagram from my previous class, this was slightly small sized in the previous class. Now I have enlarged it. You can see in the topmost picture all the parts have been labeled. The basilar membrane, on top of it is the organ of Corti with all its cells, the rods, the supporting cells, the hair cells. You can see the 3 rows of outer hair cells and a single row of inner hair cell. On top of it is the tectorial membrane. This is in the resting position. Now as the basilar membrane moves up, set up by the movement of fluid in the perilymph, you can see due to the pivot like attachment, the tectorial membrane moves to the front, causing the stereocilia to bend in one direction. And then as the basilar membrane moves down, the tectorial membrane moves back and cause another bending of the inner hair cells, and this goes on till the basilar membrane stops moving. As I have mentioned, upward movement of the basilar membrane results in the movement of the stereocilia towards the tallest member, leading to depolarization of the hair cells and firing of action potential in the auditory nerve. If you remember, if the smaller member of the stereocilia moves towards the taller ones, there is depolarization, while if it is in the opposite direction, there is hyperpolarization. Upward movement of basilar membrane causes depolarization of the hair cells, while downward movement causes hyperpolarization. Now, the depolarization of the hair cells, if you remember, I have said, occurs due to the potassium entry into the cells from the endolymph. You will argue that potassium is almost of similar concentration within the endolymph as well as the intracellular fluid. So why does the potassium from the endolymph enter into the hair cell? Now this entry of potassium occurs due to the electrical gradient between the hair cell, intracellular fluid and the endolymph rather than the concentration gradient, because both of them have similar potassium ion concentration. If you again remember, try to recall that a steady current of potassium was always leaking out from the bases of the hair cells. Because the bases of the hair cells are bathed in perilymph rather than endolymph. Perilymph has a potassium concentration akin to our extracellular fluid. Hence, potassium is low in perilymph. Due to this leakage, as positive ions are going out all the time, the resting potential of the hair cells are always kept at -60, sometimes even a little bit below, while the potential of the endolymph, because of the high concentration of potassium, is high, about +80 millivolt. So the difference of about 140 millivolt drives potassium entry into the hair cells, even though concentration of potassium in both the fluids, means endolymph and intracellular fluid, are comparable. This is how depolarization is triggered within the hair cells. Potassium is not the only ion which is responsible. Initially, potassium entry occurs as the potential difference of 140 millivolt starts getting equilibrated. There is opening of voltage gated calcium channels, which causes further entry of calcium. This calcium helps in continuing the depolarization as well as causing the vesicles containing the neurotransmitters to release their contents, so that the action potential can be set up in the sensory nerve endings which arborize the bases of the hair cells. Determination of pitch and loudness of sound. I hope everyone have understood how sound is perceived. What is the mechanism of perception of sound? I would like to recapitulate it in a short form. First of all, incident sound waves fall over the tympanic membrane, causes the in and out movement, which is transduced through the ossicular chain into the movements of the perilymph of the scala vestibuli. The waves of the perilymph of the scala vestibuli is transmitted successively through the Reissner's membrane to the basilar membrane to the perilymph of the scala tympani. Ultimately, the waves are dissipated into the air of the middle ear cavity through the secondary tympanic membrane covering the round window. These waves, while they are being set up, causing the movements of the Reissner and basilar membrane, is responsible for the perception of sound. More correctly, it is the movement of the basilar membrane which is responsible for the perception of sound. How? The basilar membrane, due to its up and down movement, causes anteroposterior movement of the tectorial membrane. This anteroposterior movement of tectorial membrane ultimately causes to and fro motions of the stereocilia of the hair cells. This to and fro motion of the stereocilia of the hair cell causes depolarization and hyperpolarization of the hair cells successively. Depolarization of the hair cells releases neurotransmitter, which causes action potential to be set up among the sensory nerve fibers, which travel down their axons, reach the spiral ganglion, and from the spiral ganglion into the central nervous system, and ultimately sound is perceived. Now, how the pitch of a sound and the loudness of a sound is determined by the human ear and the brain working in conjunction. Firstly, determination of pitch. Actually, I have already discussed it in a roundabout way. So determination of pitch is known as the place principle. What is it? The major determinant of the pitch of a sound is when a sound wave strikes the ear, the place in the organ of Corti that is maximally stimulated. If you remember, the frequency or pitch determines where the maximal height of the wave of the perilymph will be in the basilar membrane. This is what it is saying, the place principle. The major determinant of the pitch perceived when a sound wave strikes the ear is the place in the organ of Corti that is maximally stimulated. The travelling wave set up by a tone, means by a sound of a particular pitch, produces peak depression of the basilar membrane and consequently maximal receptor stimulation at one point. The distance between this point and the stapes is inversely related to the pitch of the sound. That is, low tones produce maximal stimulation at the apex of the cochlea and high tones produce maximal stimulation at the base. So the maximal receptor stimulation, the point at which it is, will ultimately determine what pitch is perceived. Other parts also are stimulated, but the maximal stimulation at one point is determined by the pitch. The pathways from various parts of the cochlea are distinct. There is tonotopic arrangement, means in the brain where there is the center for auditory perception, the parts of the cerebral cortex which can perceive low tones are different compared to which can perceive higher tones. So the maximal receptor stimulation of at one point in the cochlea will maximally stimulate the nerves which are related to that part of the brain which is perceiving that tone. This is how this tonotopic arrangement of the nerves emanating from the cochlea are the determinants of tone perception. Again, sound of a particular tone will cause maximal stimulation of receptors at one particular point or place in the cochlea. This place where it is maximally stimulated is innervated by nerves which are tonotopically arranged in the cerebral cortex. So if these nerves are stimulated, we will perceive that tone. If another part is stimulated, we will perceive another tone. So this is how tone is perceived by us. First of all, the place where the cochlea is stimulated is determined by the pitch, and that pitch also determines which part of the brain will be stimulated, and this is the place principle for determination of pitch of a sound. How loudness is perceived? Here I would again like to reiterate that loudness of a sound is due to the amplitude of the sound wave, while the pitch of the sound is due to the frequency of the sound wave. The pitch is perceived according to which place the cochlea is maximally stimulated. Now how sound loudness is perceived. So same pitch sound can have different loudness. A high pitch sound can be loud or less loud or even lesser loud depending upon the amplitude of the waves. So if even the same place is maximally stimulated, say a sound of 1600 Hz, it will maximally stimulate one particular place in the cochlea. But whether that sound is loud or not loud, how will we determine that? The determination of loudness of a sound. Now an increase in loudness, that is the incident sound pressure, leads to an increase in the frequency of action potential firing by the auditory nerve bipolar cell. Or in other words, even though the place is same for same frequencies, if the loudness is more in one sound, the hair cells will fire more frequently for a louder sound compared to a less loud sound. So the place is same, so the tone that we perceive will be same, but the frequency of firing from the hair cells will be much more if the sound is loud, and this firing frequency will be carried down through the bipolar cells and reach the central nervous system, where the neurons are tonotopically arranged, so they will perceive the tone, but more number of neurons will be perceiving the tone. So the more number of neurons that perceive the tone will make us perceive the sound to be louder. The number of auditory neurons that fire increases with increasing loudness. Thus, the loudness of a sound is determined from the frequency of the action potentials in the auditory nerve and the number of auditory neurons stimulated. This principle is also known as the Pauli principle. So, the frequency is determined by the place principle, while the loudness is determined by the Pauli principle. Next we come to sound localization. How do we localize where the sound is coming from? Up till now we have perceived sound. We have the mechanism to perceive how the sound is in character, means whether it is high pitched or low pitched, or whether it is loud or not that loud. But how do we determine where is it coming from? Now, determination of localization of sound. Now, determination of the direction from which a sound emanates in the horizontal plane depends on two factors. One is detecting the difference in time between the arrival of the stimulus in the 2 ears. Means the sound will either come from the right or left. So there will be a difference in time between the arrival of the stimulus in the 2 ears, and there will be a consequent difference in phase of the sound waves on the two sides of the brain. Also, the loudness of the sound will be more on the side which is closest. So the fact that the sound is louder on the side which is closest to the source also helps us to localize the sound. It has been found that the detectable time difference, which can be as little as 20 microseconds, is said to be the most important factor at frequencies below 3000 Hz. Means for lower frequency sounds, it's the difference in time between its arrival in the two ears which is more important for us to localize it. For higher frequency sounds, it is the difference in loudness which helps us to determine where it is coming from. Now sounds coming directly in front of the individual differ in quality from those coming from behind because of the disposition of the pinna. I have said in my first class that the pinna helps in sound localization because of its disposition. The way it is disposed helps us to determine whether the sound is coming from front or it is coming from behind. Also, if a sound is coming from above or sound is coming from below, how do we determine that? It is determined by the reflections of the sound from the pinnal surface. As the sound moves up and down, the reflections of the sound waves and the change in the sound waves due to the pinnal reflection is the primary factor in locating the sounds in the vertical plane. So if a sound moves up or down, it is reflected in a particular manner from the pinnal surface. Our brain is equipped to distinguish these patterns and identify these reflected sound waves, and this is how we can determine whether the sound is coming from above or at the level of the ear or below. Ultimately, the sound localization is a very complex process, much more complex compared to pitch and loudness, and it is done in the Brodmann area 41 of the brain, and it has been found that if there is any disease or lesion in that area, sound localization is markedly disrupted. So even though we can perceive sound or speech and loudness, we might fail to localize it if the Brodmann area 41 of the auditory cortex is damaged. The next section of our discussion will be the central auditory connections, means the connections from the spiral ganglion to the area 41 of Brodmann on the cerebral cortex, which is responsible for auditory perceptions. How the nerve fibers from the spiral ganglion reach the cerebral cortex. It is important to know all these pathways, not only auditory pathways. You shall also encounter visual pathway, pathways for touch, pathways for pain, pathways for proprioception while you study central nervous system. It is important to know these pathways because lesions in different parts of these pathways will cause different clinical manifestations. So let's begin our discussion on central auditory connections. If you remember, the spiral ganglion was composed of bipolar cells. Bipolar cells means they had two processes. One was receiving signal from the basal parts of the hair cells, while the other one was relaying the signal towards the central nervous system. These fibers which relates the signal towards the central nervous system constitute the auditory or cochlear division of the 8th cranial nerve. Where do they enter the brain substance proper after originating in the spiral ganglia? They enter the brain substance proper at the level of the brain stem, more precisely at a place known as the cerebellopontine angle on the ventral surface of the brain stem at the level of the pons and medullary junction. Now, after they reach the cerebellopontine angle, the fibers of this auditory division of the 8th cranial nerve, they ultimately end on two nuclei, namely the dorsal and ventral cochlear nuclei, which are at the level of the medulla oblongata. So this is the end of the first order neurons of the auditory pathway. From the dorsal and ventral cochlear nuclei, second order neurons arise. But the pathways these second order neurons take are different for the two nuclei. Firstly, for the ventral cochlear nuclei, there are several outputs. Namely, there are three important ones. One to the same-sided superior olivary nucleus, the other-sided superior olivary nucleus, and another structure which is known as the nuclei of the lateral lemniscus, which is at a higher level compared to the cochlear nuclei. Where is that situated? It is situated in the pons. And these ventral cochlear nuclei give their outputs to the contralateral nuclei of the lateral lemniscus. So again, what are the three outputs of the ventral cochlear nuclei? The three are: first to the same-sided superior olivary nucleus, then to the opposite side superior olivary nucleus, and then to the opposite side nucleus of lateral lemniscus, which is situated at a higher level in the pons. And while it reaches the nuclei of the lateral lemniscus, it traverses another structure known as the trapezoid body. Now, the dorsal cochlear nucleus, it does not give any supply to the superior olivary nucleus. It gives the supply directly to the opposite side nuclei of lateral lemniscus. So the nuclei of lateral lemniscus of the opposite side receives inputs from both the ventral and the dorsal cochlear nuclei. From the ventral, the pathway is through the trapezoid body. For the dorsal, it does not traverse the trapezoid body. It just crosses the midline and reaches the contralateral nuclei of lateral lemniscus of the pons. So the second order neurons from the dorsal and ventral cochlear nuclei have either reached the superior olivary nucleus or the nuclei of the lateral lemniscus. What happens to those fibers that have reached the superior olivary nucleus? Or in other words, what is the output of the superior olivary nucleus? Fibers from bilateral superior olivary nuclei ultimately relay to both ipsilateral as well as contralateral nuclei of the lateral lemniscus. So ultimately what it stands at is the superior olivary nucleus is just a substation from where the fibers reaches both sides nuclei of the lateral lemniscus. So, in other words, from the cochlear nuclei, all fibers ultimately reach bilateral nuclei of lateral lemniscus. That is their final part up to where they have reached. What happens from there onwards? Fibers from each group of nuclei of the lateral lemniscus reach the ipsilateral inferior colliculus of the midbrain. Means these fibers are again ascending. From the cochlear nuclei and superior olivary nucleus, which were level of the medulla, they reached the nuclei of the lateral lemniscus, which were at the level of the pons. Now from there, they further ascend and reach the same-sided inferior colliculus of the midbrain. So these are the third or fourth order neurons. If they have come from the superior olivary nucleus, then it is the fourth order neurons. If they have come from the direct pathway from the cochlear nuclei directly to the nuclei of the lateral lemniscus, then they are the third order neurons. So in the auditory pathway, the first order neurons arise from the spiral ganglion, second order from the cochlear nuclei, third order can arise from the lateral lemniscal nuclei or from the superior olivary nucleus. Fourth order can arise from lateral lemniscal nuclei if the third order has come from the superior olivary nucleus. So ultimately these third or fourth order neurons reach the inferior colliculus of the midbrain of the same side. However, both the nuclei of lateral lemniscus communicate among themselves too through fibers known as the Probst's commissure. What happens thereafter? After these fibers have reached the inferior colliculus of the midbrain. So from the inferior colliculus of the midbrain, the fourth or fifth order neurons are now relaying. Where? To the medial geniculate nucleus or medial geniculate body of the thalamus of the same side. So from the right side it will go towards the right, from the left side they will go towards the left. From the inferior colliculus of the right, fibers goes towards the medial geniculate nucleus of the right, and from the left towards the left. However, the inferior colliculi on both sides are communicating with each other again through commissural fibers. What happens from the medial geniculate body onwards? Here, from the medial geniculate body, there is nerve fibers which are known as the auditory radiations, and they ultimately relay to Brodmann area 41 of the transverse temporal gyrus on the temporal lobe, which is the auditory cortex. There is no communication between bilateral medial geniculate nucleus. So ultimately the fibers from the medial geniculate nucleus reaches the Brodmann area 41 of the auditory cortex, and here the auditory pathway ends. So again let's try to recapitulate with the help of a diagram. So this is the schematic diagram. You can see below towards your left the spiral ganglion is shown. From there, fibers which are the auditory division of the vestibulocochlear nerve are reaching the dorsal and ventral cochlear nuclei. From the ventral, you can see fibers are reaching the superior olivary complex or olivary nucleus, or they can go towards the contralateral nucleus of the lateral lemniscus through the trapezoid body, in case if it is coming from the superior olivary complex, or from the dorsal side it goes to the contralateral nucleus of the lateral lemniscus without relaying in the trapezoid body. You can appreciate also from the level of the medulla they have ascended and reached the level of the pons. From the superior olivary complex you can see fibers are going towards both sides of the nucleus of the lateral lemniscus. So ultimately the nucleus of the lateral lemniscus is the relay center at the level of the pons. You can also see the Probst's commissure is marked where the two nuclei of the lateral lemniscus are communicating with each other. Again you see the nuclei of the lateral lemniscus are relaying to the inferior colliculus at the level of the midbrain. They are reaching and there is no contralateral supply, though the two inferior colliculi are communicating with each other through commissural fibers. Ultimately from the inferior colliculi, ipsilateral supply is reaching the medial geniculate nucleus, which is at the level of the thalamus, and from there the auditory radiation is reaching the primary auditory cortex. These you have to remember first of all to pass your exam, that is secondary actually. Primary requirement for learning all these pathways is for you to understand the waves of brainstem evoked response audiometry or BERA, which you shall be studying in your phase 3 part 1, means third prof part 1 of previous syllabus. There when you study BERA you will see waves and you will understand different waves are of different characters because they are coming from the different pathways or different sections of the auditory pathway. In humans, the primary auditory cortex has tonotopic mapping, as I have already said while I was discussing the mechanism for perception of different tones or different frequencies. What is the order of this tonotopic mapping? Low frequencies are represented rostrally and high frequencies are represented caudally. There are several additional auditory receiving areas like secondary auditory cortex or Brodmann area 42 and Brodmann area 22, which are concerned with processing of auditory signals related to speech. Tonotopic organization is less marked in these regions. This is a schematic diagram. You can see the primary auditory cortex area 41 or A1 is marked, and it is subdivided on the basis of what type of tones is perceived by which areas. As I have said, the low frequencies are represented rostrally, means towards the top, and the higher frequencies are represented caudally, that is near the bottom. Also here you can see the secondary auditory cortex is also marked. Next, I would like to discuss a bit about the sound intensity and concept of decibels. Now, the intensity of sound or its loudness, as I have already said, depends on the amplitude of the sound waves. The amplitude of a sound wave is the total change in pressure that occurs during a single cycle. It can be expressed in terms of the maximum pressure change at the eardrum, which is designated as P. Now, the range of amplitudes can be infinite. So, to make matters simple, or rather measurable, the P is expressed in a logarithmic scale to make the intervals more spaced. And how? As a ratio of a reference pressure, P ref, and this scale is known as the decibel scale. What is the equation for decibel scale? Here the equation is the sound pressure level, or SPL, in decibels of any sound is equal to 20 times log to the base 10 of the ratio of incident sound pressure and P reference. So P reference had to be calculated. It had been found that a pressure of 0.0002 dynes per centimeter square is the threshold of human hearing. Means this is the least pressure over the eardrum that can cause a movement of the ossicular chain and can be perceived as a tone by the human ear. Whatever tone is there, if it is producing a pressure less than this amount, human ear usually does not perceive it as a sound. So the P reference is again the threshold of human hearing. The ratio of the incident pressure, or P, and the P reference, when taken as a logarithm to the base 10 and multiplied by 20, gives our value in decibels for that sound. Or in other words, the unit of SPL, which is decibel, if there is a 10-fold increase in SPL, the equivalent amount of increase in decibel is 20. So decibel is a logarithmic scale. It tries to quantify the sound pressure level that the eardrum receives with each type of sound. There are different ranges of decibel for which different nomenclatures have been given on the basis of our subjective feeling. It has been found sounds that cause sound pressure levels of 120 to 160 decibel over the eardrum are classified as painful sounds. Example, the sounds produced by firearms or jet planes when they take off. Sound pressure levels of 90 to 110 decibels is classified as very loud, like the sounds within a subway when a train is passing, or you are sitting in front of a bass drum. It is emanating sounds of 90 to 110 decibels and it is very loud. 60 to 80 decibel sounds, like those emanating from alarm clock or busy traffic, is classified as loud. 40 to 50 decibel sounds, like moderate rainfall or normal room noise when people are talking, is considered as moderate, while 30 decibel or lesser like a whisper or within a library is considered as faint. Next, a few words about audiometry. At the outset, I will like to clear that audiometry as such is not a part of first prof syllabus. It is more in the desirable to know section. I won't be going into much details, just basic outlines of what it is. Auditory acuity is commonly measured with an audiometer. The device presents the subject with pure tones of various frequencies through earphones. At each frequency, the threshold intensity is determined and plotted on a graph as a percentage of normal hearing. So we have to have a normal hearing chart before we proceed for such pure tone audiometry. It provides an objective measurement of the degree of deafness and a picture of the tonal range most affected. Means if a person is being tested by pure tone audiometry, first of all we need to have a normal hearing chart. Thereafter, for each tone, the person's threshold intensity is determined. If they match the normal, that means the person has no deafness. If they are below the normal, then the person has some percentage of deafness. The percentage is calculated. Sometimes it is seen the person has normal hearing for few tones while it is abnormal or less for other tones. That is the tonal range. Means their deafness is for a few tones while the hearing is normal for others. This is example of pure tone audiometry. There are different types of audiometry I must mention, like impedance audiometry or brainstem evoked response audiometry. They are different techniques. You shall learn about them in details in your phase 3 classes of ENT. Lastly, a few words about deafness. Now, deafness or hearing loss is the most common sensory defect in humans, more commoner than blindness. According to the World Health Organization, over 270 million people worldwide have moderate to profound hearing loss, with 1/4 of these cases beginning as early as childhood. And I am telling you these numbers are rising because of our lifestyles. Now, first thing I like to discuss is the term presbycusis. What is presbycusis? It is the gradual hearing loss associated with aging. Affects more than 1/3 of those over 75 years of age and is probably due to gradual cumulative loss of hair cells and neurons. Here I would like to mention, now this age 75 years has come down. It has come down to 70 years. Now it has been found that over 1/3 of those who survive above 70 years have some variety of presbycusis. You can see old aged people, your grandparents or someone in the neighborhood wearing hearing aids. That is nothing but he is trying to or she is trying to get over her hearing loss due to presbycusis, and this is a age related disease. and it is postulated that is probably due to gradual cumulative loss of the hair cells. Now, in most cases, the hearing loss is rather multifactorial. It can be caused by both genetic or environmental factors. Deafness can be divided into two major categories. It can be either conductive deafness or sensory neural hearing loss. Conductive deafness, as the name suggests, refers to impaired sound transmission in the external or middle ear and impacts all sound frequencies. Means if there is conductive deafness, there will be deafness in all frequencies. Among the causes of conduction or conductive deafness are firstly plugging of the external auditory canal with wax or foreign bodies which blocks the sound waves, or an inflammation of the outer ear known as otitis externa, very common in swimmers, or a otitis media or inflammation of the middle ear cavity causing fluid accumulation and restriction of movement of the ossicles, or there could be a perforation of the eardrum or the tympanic membrane resulting in imperfect movement of the tympanic membrane when sound falls on it, or there could be otosclerosis, which is a disease in which bone is resorbed and replaced with sclerotic bone, affects the ossicles and thereby ossicular movement is restricted, and this otosclerotic bone ultimately grows over the oval window, and so the footplate of the stapes, which was a mobile structure, becomes rather fixed and the person suffers from conductive type of deafness. Sensory neural deafness, as the name suggests, is most commonly either due to loss of the hair cells or any disease affecting the hair cells, or due to problems in the 8th cranial nerve, that is the auditory nerve, or within the central auditory pathways. One interesting feature of sensory neural deafness is often it has been found that the deafness affects certain pitches or tones while others are unaffected. This is because the disease can affect only one part of the cochlea where certain tones are perceived, while the others where the other tones are perceived remains normal. Contrary to conductive deafness, which affected all tones universally, sensory neural deafness can spare certain tones and affect others. One important sensory neural deafness variety is that caused by aminoglycoside antibiotics. Now these aminoglycoside antibiotics are very commonly used antibiotics. Prototype member is gentamicin. There are others like amikacin, kanamycin, netilmicin and a host of others which are used very commonly in clinical practice. It has been found that at higher doses, these antibiotics can cause damage to the mechanosensitive channels in the tiplings of the stereocilia of the hair cells. Damage in this permanent and they degenerate these mechanosensitive channels. If you remember, the potassium that entered the hair cells and caused its depolarization from the endolymph entered through these channels only. So if they are damaged, the depolarization of hair cells is abnormal or absent, and hence there is no depolarization of the afferent nerves and the sound is not perceived. So this ultimately leads to sensory neural hearing loss. Also, vestibular function is affected because the similar hair cells are there in the vestibular apparatus also. Now, damage to outer hair cells by prolonged exposure to noise is also associated with hearing loss, because it has been found that the sensitivity of the inner hair cells to sound is often regulated by the outer hair cells. So if they are damaged, the sensitivity of the inner hair cells to sound can be reduced. So prolonged exposure to noise, just like so many of you have, or your generation have, the habit of hearing loud music through earphones, can cause damage to outer hair cells, ultimately leading to sensory neural hearing loss. Other causes of sensory neural hearing loss include tumors of 8th cranial nerve, or the cerebellopontine angle, or vascular damage in the medulla oblongata. So thank you for listening to such boring lectures. I hope I have been able to impart some knowledge regarding the physiology of hearing to you. Hope you all are doing well also. Thank you once again. This is all about the physiology of hearing. Regarding the vestibular apparatus and physiology of maintenance of equilibrium, I shall be returning back to you very shortly. Have a nice time. Thank you.